From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast.
Good morning. I'm so happy to be here and so happy that you're here as well. Just a few things on the sort of housekeeping side of things. I've prepared my presentation with notes. There's notes under the slides if you look for them. And instead of having to try to scribble, because I will talk faster than you can scribble, then you can get a copy of the presentation for $10 after the presentation. And if I run out, then I'm prepared to make more, so you'll have to catch up with me afterwards. I have a tendency when I give a presentation to give, my wife tells me this, to give too much information. And sometimes that sidetracks me. And so it'll be better if I don't go into those digressions quite so much, and you can ask me questions afterwards. I will give you so much information that you won't remember it all anyway. My first slide here is the points that I want to cover in this presentation. The first one is the origins of total testing, and I want to give some indication of where total testing services might be available in this country. I want to give some examples of interpreting these tests, and I also want to touch on plant or tissue testing because it is total testing, and it's very revealing. And then last of all, I want to talk about compost testing, because if we're testing composts and we're not doing total testing, then we're not getting the full story on the compost. And to wrap it up, I want to leave you with the thought of why we need to use total testing. Now, back in the mid-19th century, there was a figure in chemistry, in the world of chemistry, that towered above all others. He was the editor of the Journal of Analytical Chemistry. And those of us who've studied chemistry well know that a huge proportion of the literature in chemistry is in German. And German was required in my chemistry curriculum as a second language. Justus von Liebig, back in the 1840s and 50s, was developing, first of all, he introduced the laboratory method of teaching chemistry. He wanted to teach chemistry hands-on, best way to learn it. And he developed many of the analytical techniques that were used to identify amounts of quantitative, not just the qualitative analysis, to find out how much gold or silver or lead or any of these elements, how much was present in any given substance. So most of the tests used as mining assays for ores were developed by Liebig, and the whole procedures of analytical chemistry used in the 19th century, where just incidentally mining really took off in a big way, they were developed by Liebig. In many cases, gold is present in an ore in quantities that are so slight that you would not visually detect it. But if you had the ore sample analyzed, then you might find that you could crush and powder this quartz rock and extract the gold from it, and you would have a significant gold mine. Okay, let me fix that. Thank you. Yeah, I stepped away from one microphone and didn't turn the other one on. Okay, to recapitulate, Justus von Liebig was the giant of analytical chemistry of the 19th century that really revolutionized chemistry. And most of what he did was based on total testing. An Aqua Regia Digest. This is an extract of an ore sample that uses concentrated hydrochloric and nitric acid, and in many cases also sulfuric acid, to extract elements in a soluble form so they can be tested for their presence and their quantity. The presence of the element is called qualitative analysis, and the quantity is called quantitative analysis. And Liebig introduced the laboratory method of teaching chemistry and developed these tests. And then this spread throughout the world, and particularly the mining industry was revolutionized by it. So that people could take an ore sample and find out just how rich it was in copper or zinc or whatever. Now, when it came to agriculture, these farmers had found their crops, their fields were running down in fertility. And they didn't know why, and they didn't know what to do about it. And here was this professor of huge renown, international, like, giant figure, and they went and sought him out and said, "What can you do for us? Our fields are declining in fertility." And he said, basically, "I'll see what I can do." And he analyzed the crops to see what their ash contained, what elements were present. And in the case of burning them, then he had to do other analyses to see how much carbon, how much nitrogen, the things that would burn up, the sulfur, was present. But he analyzed the crops to see what was present in them. And then he analyzed their soils to see what was present in the soils, because he reckoned that it had to be in the soil in order to get in the plant. Now, there were some serious errors in his reasoning, but he sort of did this with his left hand while he was doing all sorts of other things. And toward the end of his life, then before his death, several years before his death, after his retirement, then he recanted. He was aware, before he died, of his errors in agriculture. And this was his mea culpa. The way he wrote it, now I've translated this from the German because one of our agricultural consultants in Australia had heard about this, I'd heard about it, and we couldn't find it on the internet in English. So he located it, he searched for 6 months on the internet in his odd hours. And he found it in German. And when I learned German, I went to Germany to learn it. So I thought, well, I've got a feeling for the language, why don't I translate it? So this was my translation. The bondage of error. At one time, the view permeated my every fiber that plants obtained their nourishment in soluble form. This view was false and was the source of my errant behavior. But the human mind is a curious thing, and it sees nothing beyond its field of vision. In other words, as we know now in quantum physics very well, what you look for is what you find. If you don't look for it, you won't find it. And he wasn't looking for more than just the soluble components in the soil. And his tests for soils that he devised did not use the Aqua Regia Digest, the total acid extract. They used a weak solution of organic acids such as citric, acetic, oxalic, etc. So these were dilute solutions of weak organic acids. Reasoning, of course, was that plants were excreting these acids in exchange for the nutrients from the soil. And that was true insofar as it was true. But there was a lot more going on besides, which he realized well before his death. He said, in truth, agriculture is both contemplative and spiritual. Unfortunately, almost no one realizes the true beauty of agriculture, its inner spirituality and beingness. It warrants the best efforts of science, not only because of its produce and the benefits it bestows on those who understand the language of nature, but because it stands above all other vocations. And I think it's profoundly interesting that Liebig understood this, because agriculture alone, amongst all professions, is the basis of our culture. Take a beginner's course in sociology. In my sociology course 101, it was on the first page of our textbook. Modern society is agrarian. It's no wheel turns, no civilization is built without the produce from agriculture. And agriculture alone fills this role. I know the economists say, oh, it's only 3% of the GDP, or maybe it's 2%. So don't worry about agriculture. But really and truly, agriculture is the foundation of our society. And maybe I might add that Wendell Berry put it this way: you can't be free if you depend on someone else for your food. And what's going on in the international trade of grain and other agricultural products is not supportive of the producers in agriculture. And it's something to think about. And it's really interesting that Liebig took this on. He was really a great genius in chemistry. Sometimes he gets a bad rap for being the father of chemical agriculture. But he recanted this in his later years, and also, very interestingly enough, as my final wish, I pass on the mission to cleanse my teachings of the accumulated lies others have used to obscure them, lo these many years. Well, unfortunately, by the time he retired and everything, the chemical industry had taken off with his recommendations and his early work in agriculture, and found this to be profoundly profitable. And they didn't want to listen to any mea culpas from Justus von Liebig. When I got into farming, and in my second year, my wife, who was not my wife then, she was my neighbor, and she introduced me to biodynamics. And she came rolling down the road and said, "Peter Escher's at my farm today." And I said, "Fine, who's Peter Escher?" And she said, "Oh, he's a biodynamic farming consultant." And she just had a whole bunch of stuff to say about him. It turned out Peter Escher was the partner of Aaron Fried Pfeiffer in setting up his laboratories in Spring Valley, New York. And Pfeiffer, who I read quite a bit, he wrote extensively in agriculture. Pfeiffer was doing total testing on soils back in the 50s. And it was very revealing, because it showed that there were massive amounts of things like NP and K in the soil's total tests, even though they did not show up in the soluble tests. And if you understand biodynamics, you're working with life processes, biodynamics. And it's the life processes that make these elements that are present in the soil available. And in actual fact, we do not want to have our nutrients soluble beyond just a very low level for two reasons. One of them is that they'll wash away. So if you're selling soluble fertilizers, boy, you're in a good business, because you put them on in a soluble form, they'll wash away, and you'll make more sales every year. The other reason is that plants can only absorb a tiny amount in a single day. And it's much better to have a process working in the soil that steadily solubilizes a tiny amount, just enough to give the plant a luxury feed of freshly solubilized nutrients. So to put in large quantities of soluble nutrients shuts down these processes in the soil, because the living organisms that are making these slight amounts of nutrients available on an hourly and daily basis find out if they're flooded with too much all at once, it shuts them down. It would be like having so much nitrogen, for example, in a flush that the microbes that fix nitrogen and solubilize nitrogen would be living, metaphorically, in their own septic tank. And just think how attractive that would be. Would they be active and jumping and jiving? Not at all. Now, in the past, I've looked for laboratories that could routinely do total testing in soils. And a colleague of mine, Steve Diver, who's in Austin, Texas, used to be in Fayetteville, Arkansas, he has used this laboratory with some success. And this is a laboratory, actually, that is in Vancouver, Canada. And it's a mining laboratory, because what we're doing with an aqua regia digest is commonly what's done in the mining industry. Here at this conference so far, I have encountered one other person that came up to my booth, Matt Stuckenholz. Maybe he's in the room, maybe he's not. But Matt at Midwest Laboratories says we do total tests. It's just that nobody requests them. Well, I'll tell you a little story. When I migrated to Australia, and knowing the need for total testing, then the company I was working with a laboratory called Environmental Analysis Laboratories. And I called them up and I talked to the head of the laboratory, and I said, we need to have total tests on soils. And he says, fine, what do you need? We can do your major cations and phosphoruses, and when total testing is requested, usually that's what's done. But I said, no, I need to have total zinc, total boron, total copper, manganese. And he says, well, we don't do that. And I said, yes, you do. I said, what do you do for a plant tissue analysis? He says, oh, we do a total acid extract. An aqua regia digest. I said, that's what I want on soils. I want all of these things, molybdenum and cobalt. And he said, oh, we can do that. And I said, at the same price of a tissue analysis? He said, yeah, I think so. And so ever since, we've been doing total testing on soils, and I might add, this must include silicon. Silicon is of the highest importance in agriculture, even silicon. That's element number 14 in the periodic table. And it's right underneath carbon and shares the same chemical properties of carbon. It's right dead in the middle of the periodic table, and it can react in either direction. But silicon is the basis of capillary action. And that's true in plants and animals. Capillary action is what will lift water in a little thin silica tube, will lift it up the tube from a saucer in defiance of gravity. And it's the basis of transport of all of your nutrients in plants. Now, plants do get nutrients such as carbon. They get it through their leaf. It is the major source of carbon for a plant. They can take up some carbon from soil compounds, particularly in the amino acid range. But for the most part, plants get nearly all their carbon from the atmosphere. And Lord knows in these times, we have a serious abundance of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's other things that plants can take up from the atmosphere, and silicon is one of them. When Liebig was determining, the plants take this up, and in this field here, they're taking up this amount. It might be 15 parts per million. In an adjacent field or in a field somewhere a little ways away, the same variety of plants takes up 150 parts per million of the same substance. And in another test, it took up 300 parts per million, which is 20 times as much as it took up in the first field. Liebig said, we don't even know if that's essential or not, whether the plant has to have it. So in order to determine if a substance is essential, then let's exclude it from the growing medium and see. If the plant still is able to grow without it, then it isn't essential. Or at least, if it were essential, the amount would be so insignificant that it would be available practically anywhere. So that was the gold standard, so to speak, of whether something was an essential nutrient. But guess what? Silicon is everywhere. It dissolves off the surface of glass in the presence of distilled water at parts per 10 million. It will be in the particulate matter in the atmosphere. Tests analyzing the various levels of dust found that virtually all the particles below half a micron in size were silica particles. It's present in the dust in the atmosphere. And so Liebig never succeeded, and no one else has, in excluding silicon from the growing medium. So it never was proven to be an essential nutrient according to that protocol. However, it is widely recognized today as beneficial. And really, that's because it's essential. You do not have capillary action in plants without it. And you do not get any other nutrients into the plant from the soil without silicon. Now, there's a relationship between boron and silicon because boron readily reacts with silicon. And it works sort of like this. Boron has 3 reactive electrons, silicon has 4. And where borate replaces silicate in the plant's capillary system, then there's an unpaired electron on the part of silica, and it's drawing on water and electrolytes to satisfy that need for a partner in that electron bonding. And the more borate is taking the place of silicate, the more sap pressure you develop in that plant. So let me move on here. Just having touched on that, you really have to ask your laboratories and insist upon an analysis for silicon in both your soluble and your total tests, in your plant tissue tests. You must test for silicon. It is of the highest importance in agriculture. Now, you won't be able to read this, but this is an overview of the sort of testing that I advise my clients. Over on this side are the soluble analysis. Most of these figures are arrived at with what's called a Melick 3 test. There's various tests for various elements. And in case of sulfur, I'm using a Morgan test. In case of silicon, it's a calcium chloride test. So there's a few other tests thrown into this picture, but basically it's a Melick 3 test. And it's a certain type of weakly acidic solution that encourages an exchange of cations because it contains EDTA in the solution. Over on this side are the totals. This is Aqua Regia Digest, or a total acid extract.
Hey, eco-farmers. This is Taylor Henry with Acres USA. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoy interviewing these folks. If you're serious about regenerative agriculture, I've got an incredible resource you need to check out, the Acres USA membership. You farm in the physical world, and you deserve a physical printed magazine to match. Since 1971, Acres USA magazine has been the leading voice in ecological agriculture. delivering the best insights from regenerative farmers, agronomists, and researchers to help you farm profitably without toxic chemicals. Our membership included physical and digital copies of the magazine each month of the year, which has always been a standard for Acres USA, but we wanted to over-deliver on content. When I acquired this business, I was happy to find that we had years of audio files from presentations at our annual EcoAg conference. And guess what? They were hiding. Well, not anymore. We developed this membership portal that gives you access to the recordings from farmers like Gabe Brown, Gary Zimmer, Joel Salatin, and Mark Shepard. We also include recordings of private events. Finally, if you are like me and you like listening to content, we are now producing a membership-only podcast of each issue of the magazine, so you can consume each article while you're out in the field. To make things even sweeter, you'll get discounts on books, workshops, and events to keep expanding your knowledge. So are you ready to take your farming to the next level? Join today for a ridiculously low price at eco-farming.com or see details in the notes.
Down here are ratios of certain elements. And the important ratios to know in your total test are the ratio between carbon and nitrogen, which ideally is around 10-1. And the other most important relationship is the relationship between nitrogen and sulfur, which ideally should be somewhere around 5 or 5.5-1, nitrogen to sulfur. And you'll only find these ratios out by doing a total test. Now, there's something significant to know about a total test. It may not reveal everything that's in the soil, but it will certainly break down humic acids and show you what's stored in the humic portion of your soil. And that's the insoluble but available portion of your soil. What happens in the microbial activity of the soil is certain kinds of microorganisms store up nutrients like bees store honey in the beehive. These are your fungi and actinomycetes, and these are microorganisms that are heavily dependent on silica. Some of your fungi what they do is they don't absorb the molecule, and humic acid molecules are huge, they're enormous, and they won't pass through the cell walls of bacteria, which is the way the bacteria handle these things. So bacteria don't have access to the humic acids. It's only your fungi, actinomycetes, and protozoa that can actually utilize these nutrients. But what's going on is the fungi and actinomycetes can go down the carbon skeleton and just eat out the guts of the molecule. And that releases everything else that's on that. It's practically a colloidal molecule. And usually it's associated with clay. And these microorganisms that build these humates have to have some clay or some surface that's highly siliceous in order to use as their building site to build these humic acids. So in your composting process, and I'll say this over again later, you have to have some soil to provide those particles for your humus-forming microbes to launch from. They have to have a building site. But they also have access to these things, and when they strip it out, then the amino acids and the sulfur-containing amino acids and the various other elements that adhere to the humic acid molecules, all your cations, your trace elements, your phosphates, etc., are all like docked on these humic acid molecules. And they're not going to show up on your soluble test. And yet they're available in the soil. So you want to know how much is there in storage, because if you know you've got the right proportion of these things in storage, then you need the dynamics, the process, to be effective in your soil. You want to ramp up the process. And that's a thing about life, getting certain kinds of microbial activities, certain sorts of animal activities that will release what's over here in your total test. Now, to give you a better look at this, and you might be able to read it from here, this is the soluble test on this soil. So in this soluble test on this particular soil, there's 5% organic matter, which is a reasonably good soil to house living organisms. We're all carbon-based life forms. So if you're looking for a soil that's alive, then you want to know how much carbon it's got in it, because if it doesn't have more than, say, 1 or 2% organic matter, it cannot possibly have enough life in it to be sustainable. You really do have to look at building organic matter in the soil. And if you're using nitrogen fertilizer, we'll get to this, then you won't build organic matter. Another thing that I commonly analyze for is what's called labile carbon. And we actually did the research on the internet of how to do the labile carbon test, and we sent it to the laboratories so that they could do the test. But we wanted to know how much of that carbon that's in the organic matter is turning over. In other words, how much access do we have to the humic storehouse in that soil? And in this case, it was 1%. That's a lot higher than most soils. It really shows you that it's a living soil. And I'm sorry to say my graph bar isn't working well enough. It should have been out here at the edge of the adequate zone, because the adequate zone, the target zone, is between 0.8 and 1.2%. Now you'll see in this soil test also that down here in terms of, where's my pointer gone? Must have had my finger over it. Phosphorus is a little bit lower than my target range, and so is sulfur. And above all, I'm super deficient in manganese. Manganese is one of the cofactors of phosphorus, and in this case, there's a deficiency in the soluble test. But let's look at the total test. Over here on this side is the totals. And if I looked at nitrate, it says 16 parts per million, and ammonium is 2 parts per million. Now that's adding up to 18 parts per million, and there's a little oxygen and hydrogen in there too. So the actual nitrogen in the soluble test is very low. It's actually below 18 parts per million. It's down around 9 or something, actual nitrogen. Over here in the total test, total nitrogen is 2,610 parts per million. Oh, we got heaps and heaps of nitrogen in the total test. And we can be sure that a large portion of this nitrogen, if not all of it, is part of these humic acid complexes. And fortunately, we have enough labile carbon there as an indicator that there is enough life in the soil that this will release. So when we plant seeds in this soil, if they have got an energy package with them, like think how big the carbohydrate portion of a corn seed is. It's huge. And the corn seed supplies, as it sprouts, it exudes these hydrocarbons into the soil, and the microbes looking for energy come running to the feast. And they're feeding off the carbohydrates that the corn seed is giving off when it sprouts. And when you consider that it takes 10 units of carbohydrate to fix 1 unit of amino acid, then what's going on is the corn is attracting the nitrogen-fixing microbes to its roots even before the root emerges from the kernel. And if you're using fungicided seed, it'll take it about 3 days of killing off the microbes that are coming rushing to the feast, of killing them off before they can colonize the roots. So if you're interested in growing corn biologically, then if you have to buy fungicided seed, you'll do your best to wash off as much of that fungicide as possible before you plant. And my experience is, my estimate is I could wash off about 90% of it. Now, what's happening with a weed is it has a seed that's so tiny. Just imagine a wheat kernel. Its seed and the food package that's with it is easily 100 or more times larger than most weed seeds. Weeds don't have this carbohydrate gift that they carry with them to attract the microbes that do such things as solubilizing phosphorus and fixing nitrogen. They don't contain a food package to enlist the symbiosis of these beneficial microbes in the soil. What they depend on is having a high analysis over here in the soluble. And it may be just as well here with phosphorus that it's only 40 parts per million, with my target range being 50 to 70, because over here in the total test, I have 538 parts per million phosphorus. And if I'm attracting those microbes that solubilize it because they have the energy to do this, then I won't need a phosphorus fertilizer on this soil despite the soil test in the soluble. But if I want to grow weeds, it'll help enormously if I put some diammonium phosphate on this soil, because the weed is dependent upon it being soluble. It's utterly dependent on it. The weed is nature's way of scavenging up loose nutrients. And if in your composting you tie up and humify most of your nutrients, then they won't be soluble out there, and your compost will not grow weeds, unlike raw manure. And chicken manure is about the most extraordinary example of soluble nutrients in the manure. So go ahead and use raw chicken manure. I did it. Boy, did I do it. And I grew 10-foot tall ragweeds and red root pigweeds, and every weed we had, it grew 10 feet tall. Imagine trying to bush hog that down. I had to clear the radiator time after time. So, yeah, if you want a learning experience, go ahead, use raw manure. And even if you use a compost that is not a humified compost, you'll still grow plenty of weeds. And they're beneficials, actually. They're nature's way of sopping up the loose nutrients. And if we herbicide them, then we don't sop up those loose nutrients. And where do they go if they're soluble? Yeah, any water that's running out of the field or running down through the soil in that field will carry the loose nutrients with it. And then you'll be buying more fertilizer next year. Weeds are great things to compost to get really high analyses of nutrients in your compost, but you want those nutrients in an insoluble but available state. You want those nutrients humified, or your compost isn't good enough. So let me move along. When I look at a soil test and I want to interpret it, I look at the CEC and the TEC. In this case, the soil's pH is 7. And at pH of 7, the CEC and the TEC are the same. There's no free hydrogen in the soil. And hydrogen in your cation, like the cation base saturation, hydrogen is your acid. It's an indicator of acid. So in this case here, this is a moderately, it's probably a clay loam soil, and it's got a CEC of 14.24. Now, as you get into heavier clays, you get into larger CECs. The CEC is your storehouse. It's how big your pantry is in the soil. And if you keep your soil topped up so that what inputs you're putting on are the ones that you need, the back shelf of your pantry may have enormous quantities of such things as magnesium and iron and so forth. But out here on the outer shelves, you want to have those nutrients that you need in a relatively good balance, so that as the soil particles react with each other and they react with the plant to exchange these cations. And that's why it's called the cation exchange capacity. It's your soil's ability to store nutrients. CECs on heavy clays, nice black cracking clays, will be up in the 80s. Whereas sandy soils will be down below 6. And I have seen in Florida on what is affectionately called sugar sand, because it looks like your sugar bowl, and CECs below like 0.43, below 0.5% or half of a unit of cation exchange capacity. And this just means the soil can't hold on to very much. Now, let me go back here. I also, because I've looked at the CEC and the pH, and I've looked at actually the organic matter and the labile carbon. And one last thing here, the calcium to magnesium ratio. Ideally, in this particular soil, and there's a kind of a sliding scale, and it's such a complex calculation that it takes a couple seconds in the Excel format to calculate it. If I was to calculate this by hand, I'd be here until this afternoon. But to find out what the ideal ratio is in a soil that's this particular CEC is a very great calculation. It gets up to as high as a 7-to-1 calcium-magnesium ratio. But what that calcium-magnesium ratio tells you is how tight or how crumbly is the soil. If the soil is real tight, air and water do not diffuse through the soil very well, and they're absolutely essential. So what you want to have is a soil that mechanically opens up and has crumb structure. It has to have spaces, passageways between the particles, and that's why, even though you may have to put far more calcium into the soil than any crop you would grow on it could use, you still want to have that mechanical activity. Calcium gives up its electrons far more readily than magnesium. So magnesium bonds tightly in the soil and doesn't give up its electrons very readily. Both of these cations are +2 elements. If magnesium gave up 2 electrons, it would give up 1/6 of its charge. So it's like Ebenezer Scrooge when it comes to holding on to its electrons. That's its currency. And boy, does it hold on. But if you look at calcium, if it gives up 2 electrons, that's only 1/10 of its total charge. So calcium is a lot more like Henry VIII, a glutton, no doubt, but very free with his money. So when you look at these 2 elements, you can see the sort of behavior of Ebenezer Scrooge, and he's in his counting house, and it's dark, and he's fondling his money. But Henry VIII is out there boldly on the battlefield and at the parties and all the rest of this sort of stuff. Had how many wives? And so he's much more generous in terms of spreading his currency around. So magnesium is so much of a miser that it's used in chlorophyll to catch light. There's almost nothing else that can do it like magnesium. And in fact, if you were to take magnesium twists and light them off, it'll be about the brightest thing you've ever seen because you free the light that's being held by magnesium. And boy, a magnesium flare is super bright. It's almost as bright as my mind goes. It really goes. So let's look here now at the soluble versus the total with nitrogen and phosphorus in this soil. If I looked at, and I already said this, the nitrate and ammonium as compared to the total nitrogen, see how much total nitrogen there is here? If I was looking for an ideal ratio of 10-to-1 carbon to nitrogen, then I'm actually just tipped a little bit above my target level, which is just fine. This soil, as its microbes dig into the storehouses, whenever it's a little too dry, or whenever it's a little too wet, or whenever there's any kind of stress, then the microbes living in symbiosis with the plant will dig into the storehouse. Maybe it's cloudy for a week. And so there's not enough root exudate coming down from the plant, and the microbes will dig into the storehouse and keep the plant going and even things out. And there's heaps of nitrogen in storage, all you need. The same thing is pretty much true of phosphorus here, and actually there's a slight deficiency. My target range in soluble phosphorus is between 50 and 70 parts per million, and I'm only showing up 40 parts per million on the Melick 3 test. So what I've got here in the totals is 538 parts per million, and my target for phosphorus is closer to 600. But I'm pretty close. I could add a little rock phosphate, not soluble phosphorus. Forget the MAP and the DAP and the superphosphates. But when it comes to adding phosphorus, I really like rock phosphate or colloidal phosphate. The colloidal phosphate out of Florida is really good. When I started farming, I bought a heap of it off of Kerry Reams. And Kerry had a really good appreciation of what's going on with phosphorus. Interestingly enough, in those rock phosphates and mineral phosphates, there's virtually as much silicon as there is calcium. Silicon goes ignored, but it's of the greatest importance in agriculture. And rock phosphate supplies both silicon and calcium. What's even more interesting is all of those phosphate ores contain high levels of fluorides, and nothing solubilizes silicon like fluorine. So if you got the Florida rock phosphate, I was really interested because of my chemical background when I bought this stuff off of Kerry Reams, really interested to find that there was between 1 and 2% fluorine in the colloidal phosphate. And boy, I put it on the surface of things, and within a week, things were so sweet. Oh, man. It was amazing what a transformation occurred. And not only that, the plants got denser, stronger, and obviously had more silicon in them. So the rock phosphate was really good input. Yes, sir.
Fluorine is toxic. Does it get into the plant?
Okay, the question was, fluorine is toxic to humans. Does it get into the plant? Let me tell you, it gets into humans. And you can see examples of fluorine toxicity, fluoride toxicity, in your South Sea Islanders, elongated bone structures like very long jaws, etc. And what they're doing is they're eating a diet very rich in seafood. And they're eating off of soils where the seabirds have, for millions of years, have gone out, caught fish, come back, and they have deposited the remains on the island. And many of those islands have such a cap of what's called guano that it's mined and sold as fertilizer. And it's high in fluorine. So they, not only eating the seafood, but eating off of those soils, they get fluoride toxicity. But it wouldn't ordinarily happen. What's so crazy is we're putting fluoride in water treatment systems where there's plastic and metal pipes and no source of silicon. So you've got a sodium fluoride or a calcium fluoride or whatever form of fluoride that's added to the water treatment plant. Where is the first place it encounters enough silica to satisfy its craving? In your body. And because the brain is in the process of secreting silicic acid that goes down our nerve channels to our muscles and activates our muscles, if we're drinking fluoridated water, it saps our will. If we were, look, the model for fluoridated water that's often touted as the reason that we should have it in our drinking water is that, and this is a digression, raise your hand if you think I'm going too far astray, okay? But I think this kind of is important information, and it's the sort of thing that you'd probably have to be a biochemist to realize. But Deaf Smith County, Texas, has high fluoride waters because the fluoride is in the water table passing through strata of sand and gravel, and it picks up all of the silica it needs. And then when you drink it, you get really strong tooth enamel because apatite, which is what the mineral form is of your tooth enamel, apatite is a calcium silicophosphate, or you can say it the other way around, a silicocalcium phosphate. And it has to have silicon in partnership with calcium to form that really hard tooth enamel. And when you drink fluoridated water, if it's coming from the Deaf Smith County aquifer, then it'll build strong tooth enamel. And when you drink fluoridated water and it grabs onto the soluble silica in your nervous system, it deposits it in the tooth enamel, and you'll have Strong teeth, but a weak will. The obvious place to be adding fluoride, which is a highly soluble element and washes out of soils into the ocean in many, many, many cases, is we should be doing research on what the optimum level of fluoride is in soils, and I can assure you it couldn't be more than 2 or 3 parts per million, if that. But if we had it in the soil, the microbes that solubilize silica, such as your actinomycetes and your mycorrhizal fungi, would be better prepared. They'd have the cofactor that silica needs for its solubility in the fluoride. And we would automatically then have greater access to the silica in our soils. So we should be doing research and putting those wastes from the aluminum industry now. To get the silica out of the aluminum ore, you need fluoride. No surprise, that's how aluminum is smelted, is they use a high fluoride input in this aluminum smelting to purify the aluminum. And then they have fluorides as a waste. And they have to dispose of them because they're toxic. It's like you get too much and boy, it's toxic. And it deforms your bones and so forth. And it's carcinogenic in many of these forms. So you don't want it in your drinking water. What you do is you want to have it as an amendment to fluoride deficient soils. And then everyone would get enough fluoride. You need fluoride. It's an essential nutrient. But boy, it doesn't take much to satisfy the need. And if it was on soils, based on soil testing, and we knew this soil was deficient in it, then we'd put it where it belongs. Putting it in the water treatment plant, people like myself avoid it like the plague, because living my life, which isn't necessarily easy most of the time, I require a strong will. So I don't want to be drinking fluoridated water. But some people are going to drink a hell of a lot of it because, first of all, they probably don't know any better. And then they become couch potatoes. And you can probably identify people you know that are in that situation. So that was a little digression. Tells you the sort of thing. I'll give you too much information, don't I? My ratio here in the base saturation, you can see in that soil, was 70.77% calcium and 21.18 of magnesium. So the magnesium is way above the target. But actually this soil crumbled up pretty well because the ratio was not that far off, and it would have had enough sand in the soil at a CEC of 14 plus something that it wouldn't have been a big issue, especially if there's plenty of animal life in the soil. And down here on my totals, I've mentioned this previously, but you can see it on this slide. My carbon to nitrogen ratio was 9.87 to 1, and my nitrogen to sulfur ratio, and I'm deficient in sulfur in this soil, was 8.84 to 1. Now that nitrogen to sulfur ratio is extremely important because sulfur is the catalyst for all of your organic and biochemical reactions. Commonly in the chemistry laboratory, we would set up something like a Grignard reagent reaction, have everything together in the reacting vessel, and nothing would happen. Until we joke about it. Oh, you forgot to put a drop of sulfuric acid in there. So you put a drop of sulfuric acid in this, vessel that you're brewing this up in, and shazam, it happens. And that's because sulfur has such a great relationship with the boundaries of things. It's at the boundaries that reactions happen. Activities take place at the boundaries. And this has a lot to do with how we design our farms. We need to be looking at how we're designing our landscape so that we maximize all the various sorts of boundary phenomena that we can maximize on our farm. One of those things would be if I'm going to plant a field of corn, then I want to interplant soybeans, not because I'm going to harvest the soybeans, but because I create a secondary boundary that soaks up the sunlight that otherwise would be wasted on the surface of the soil, and it grows something that's doing something entirely different from corn. Corn is making sugar, and its root exudates are very close to 7. But soybeans are dragging oxygen out of the atmosphere, bringing it down to the root tips. If you know the origin of the word oxygen, oxy means acid in Greek. And it's the basis of acidity in chemistry. And when the legume does that, draws the oxygen down to its root tips, it has a root exudate pH of around 3.839. It's below 4. And what the soybean is doing is mining the soil for minerals. So we want to mine the soil for minerals as we grow corn, because the corn's ability to feed nitrogen fixation along its roots in the soil adhesion zone is dependent on having, it can't fix the nitrogen without the mineral nature. It needs that calcium, it needs the phosphorus, it needs the molybdenum, it needs iron and a few other things too, in order to be able to fix nitrogen. And if it doesn't have the mineral side of the picture, then it doesn't matter how much sugar the corn lets down. It won't fix nitrogen along the roots. So we want to, if we're growing corn, we want to keep that balance, that availability of minerals. We want to keep it up there at a good level. And then we can get to the point, as I did on my farm, that we planted corn, got 14, 15 foot tall corn stalks without any fertilizer. I was growing, as the Indians in Oaxaca in Mexico, the traditional Indians, I was growing corn as my major soil improvement crop because it puts more carbon into the soil than anything else I could grow. In the tropics, I could grow sugar cane, and it outdoes corn about 4-1. But in the temperate zone, where my wintertime temperatures sometimes got down in the -0 range, then I couldn't grow sugar cane. And corn was my next best crop. And I'd harvest the corn for its cobs, for its kernels, but all the rest of that carbon went back into feeding the soil, and I could build 0.5% organic matter in a single year using corn. But that was growing corn without fertilizer, using soybeans to keep the balance. They're two opposites. The soybean is dealing with calcium, and the corn is dealing with silica. Enough editorializing. This is a tissue analysis. Now, this is a total test. It's a total acid or digest, or an aqua regia extract. And what you do when you send leaf samples to the laboratory, they may wash them, because if you're in the orchard veggie business, then you may be using foliar sprays for different elements. And so you don't want to have just put on a copper spray and then send it off for analysis and find that copper is 200 parts per million in your leaf test. So this is a tissue analysis, and the reason that I used this example was this was a tissue analysis that was from the soil at the time that soil test you just saw was taken. This was on dairy pasture. And interestingly enough, despite the fact there was only 18 parts per million between the nitrate and the ammonium, in the leaf analysis, there was 3% nitrogen, which is quite a good, healthy level. Actually, though university research had set these parameters, these target levels, and they commonly set the nitrogen one high because they're expecting nitrates and those sorts of things to be the way that nitrogen is taken up. So they're expecting the leaf to actually be quite high in nitrogen. Look, ammonium is, the nitrogen, if it's amino acid nitrogen, depends on a ratio of about 6.25 to 1, and that 1 is the nitrogen. And the rest of what's weighed as an amino acid is carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. But in this case, this is virtually all amino acid nitrogen, and it's quite a good, healthy level. Wish I had had a picture of this particular paddock to show you how like lush and abundant it was. The phosphorus, despite the low level on the soluble test, was enormously high. And the potassium, which just incidentally, relies on phosphorus for the energy for the microbial release of potassium from the soil's reserve. Potassium also was quite high in the analysis. Sulfur, even though it was deficient in the soil, was also quite high. The concern here was that calcium, even though it was adequate in the soil, was low. And we want to look for the reasons why that might be. Magnesium was good. Copper was good. Zinc, which was a little deficient in the other test, was not quite adequate. And you would see this in the clover in those pastures. They would have had small leaves. When you get clovers with leaves the size of a 50-cent piece, then you've got no worries with zinc getting into the plants. Zinc ties up with phosphorus, and oftentimes when you use something like rock phosphate, you get the zinc with it. Now, one of the interesting things here is magnesium, which was super deficient in the soil analysis. It came up at least marginal inadequacy in this plant, the tissue test. Let's go back and look at where it was in the soluble and total analysis. Manganese was 6 parts per million here, but over here it was 803 parts per million. What has given us the availability of manganese in the tissue test on this field has been biological activity. And it was stored there in the humic complexes and was released by biological activity. And when you're talking about growing dairy pasture, you have to be kind of conservative about how much money you throw at it. Now, it's better than beef pasture because dairy, they get the milk check every 2 weeks or so, and they've got cash flow, and they can afford to fertilize their pastures because it pays them right back again. But with beef, most of your grazers, they sort of start to balk when you're talking about more than $20 an acre. You know, they might balk at 10 because how are they going to get it back? That's one of their concerns. Anyway, you see, whoops, I went too far here. Now, I wanted to also talk about compost. And let me look at my time here. I'm going to have to keep on moving. Ideally, compost is premium food for beneficial soil microbes. Now, I'm talking about compost that's finished compost and that we're applying to broadacre grain fields at the rate of 500 pounds per acre. We're getting good results. We're stimulating the natural soil building capacity of wheat because it's a major photosynthesizer. It feeds sugars to the soil. The microbes on the roots store those sugars as humic acids. They build the humic acids and sequester all these other minerals and tuck it in. And then when it's too cloudy, they access it. So we had just tested a wheat field here. This is just a month ago. Tested a wheat field, and we'd had a series of cloudy and drizzly days, and the Brix was 18. And that was with an application of 500 pounds per acre of well-humified compost. We'll see a picture of it. So if you want to, you can't write this all down. You probably can't read it as I go through, or you can't read all of it. But if you get the CD, you can go back and study it on your computer. If a plant takes up nitrogen as nitrate, this is a very important part. So you don't want to see a compost with a high nitrate analysis. If the plant takes up its nitrogen as nitrate, it takes roughly 10 units of sugar to convert that nitrate into an amino acid. And this happens in the leaf with something called nitrate reductase enzyme, and it's a molybdenum-based enzyme. So you have to have molybdenum in the picture there to convert the nitrate. University of Georgia found that if there wasn't sufficient molybdenum in the field when you planted corn with these high rates of nitrogen fertilizers, then the plant would soak up enough nitrate and be unable to convert it to amino acid that it wouldn't even get out of the ground. The seed would sprout and molder in the soil, and you would not get your corn out of the ground. You had to have the plenty of examples in Georgia of this happening, and so they did the research in Georgia, and they found that molybdenum was essential in planting corn to get it out of the ground because they're using so much nitrate fertilizer. On the other hand, if a plant takes up nitrogen as amino acids, it does not have this problem. This means then that you're going to have a high Brix plant because the photosynthesis won't be used up converting nitrate into amino acid. And the plant then will have a surplus of energy. It's guaranteed you're going to grow a low energy plant, a low Brix plant, if you have enough nitrate in the plant's nutrient uptake. And the plant can't exclude it. It doesn't have any choice. It's soluble and it gets in with the water. Now, one of the things we've got to understand in the making of compost, that we want to take these biological forms of nutrients, they must complex in the clay humus portion of the soil or they'll break down into soluble salts. They have to be stabilized. This is where the fungi and the actinomycetes are tying these up by building them into these complex humic acid molecules and storing them like bees are storing honey in the beehive. So all of the salts that would ordinarily be free will lock up and adhere to these humic acid complexes. So what you will get then, if you have properly humified compost, is you'll get something that stimulates and kicks off the biological activity. Now, I used to think, I'm really good at thinking the wrong things. I used to think that you made your compost in order to put on microorganisms in your compost. But actually, the microorganisms are there, but they might not be active. You put a small amount of compost on the soil, and it doesn't matter if it dries up and the microorganisms are all killed by ultraviolet rays. The food that you're putting on as humified compost is able to feed a microbial bloom in the soil that will take off in 24 hours. It can have 1,000 or 10,000 times or more the number of those microbes that are feeding on it. And you're putting on the perfect feed for the right kind of microbes, and it doesn't have to have the microbes living when you spread it. It just needs to be humified food for those microbes. I'll tell you who set me straight on that was a farmer down in southern Illinois by the name of Edwin Blosser. And he's made it his career, amongst other things, to spread the technology of making humified compost. He does a good job. This is not a commercial for him. I'm sure there's other people. I can think of another one up in Ontario by the name of Ed Sittler that also is making a very good quality humified compost. And there'd be many more. But there's plenty of people making compost that is not humified. So you got to do a test on it to see. If it's soluble, it's the waste products of the microbes that would otherwise make these things available to the plants. And so what we've got to think of when we're composting is we're not just breaking things down. Yes, we're breaking things down. When you till in a cover crop, if you till it in, it's going to be a month before you can plant because it's taking that time breaking down, and then it has to have this process of building it back up into stable humic complexes before you plant. Otherwise, the soil will be awash in these soluble nutrients, and the weeds will beat the crop. So it's only when most of the soluble nutrients are tied up in these clay humus structures that the compost becomes a hospitable environment for nitrogen-fixing, phosphorus solubilizing, and potassium-releasing microbes. If soluble NPK levels are high, the compost will suppress, rather than feed, beneficial microbial activity. Now, this is just an example of garden scale. This is my garden in Tolga, and I'm making a humified compost there, and I'm turning my compost pile. So what I did was I forked up the old compost pile and threw the stuff that was pretty coarse off to the left. Then when I rebuilt it with garden waste and a little more soil and whatnot, then I ended up with this stack, and you can see the moisture glistening on the pile. See, I put a lot of water into it as I built the compost, and I layered it and mixed as well as possible. I want to have soil coating every bit of organic matter in this compost in order to assure humification. And this was what I had that was ready to spread on the garden. So I took my garden stuff out of the garden, put it in the compost pile. Then I would plant using this. And I would put it on the surface of the soil, not mix it in. I'd prepare my bed, plant my seeds or plants or whatever, put this on top. And I'll tell you why. If I put it in the soil, some of it will be breaking down long before the plant's roots get there. And then it can oxidize to the nitrate, and I end up with a nitrate abundance in the soil, and I don't want that. So if I put it on the surface of the soil, scatter it thin, and that's the way we're doing with wheat with our compost at 500 pounds to the acre, we're spreading it over the surface and drilling our wheat without any further cultivation and letting the animal life of the soil come up and feed on these goodies. And the animal life is getting its protein out of the compost, but then it goes down to the plant's roots for its carbohydrates. And so it circulates back and forth. The nematodes and mites are too fine to see, but you'll see the ants and the earthworms and whatnot doing this. And they're making tunnels for the air passages and the water passages. And in that process, they're coming up and drinking dew if it's dry, and they're taking that down and pissing on the roots of the plant. And when they come up and eat the compost and carry it down, then they're manuring the plants right along the roots, where when the plant takes up the nitrogen in that, or like soil animal manure, then it gets it as amino acid instead of getting it as nitrate. They're not putting it into the soil anywhere else. They're my delivery system of getting the compost where it most needs to go. And so if I put it on the surface, they'll do that, and it won't get digested in the soil until it gets to the plants. And it doesn't take them long. You read Michael Crichton's new novel, Micro, and it'll give you an insight into what's going on in the microscopic level of our environment. It's a real, good novel for getting imagery that you can imagine how this really works. Now, this is large-scale compost. And in the initial phase, you're synchronizing the compost. This is a really hot breakdown phase. Chances are you're turning it every day. You want to keep the moisture above 50%. See, this is an unturned row. This has been going on for about a week or two. And you keep that moisture above 50%. You keep the temperature down below 65 degrees Celsius, which is about 168 degrees Fahrenheit, or maybe 160. And you keep the carbon dioxide level at the base of the pile below about 15%. And you can do this with probes. But just to let you know, if you want to maximize the breakdown without losing nitrogen, you don't want to lose nitrogen in composting. You build a compost pile that's got about a 25 or 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. At the end, it should be about a 10 or even a 9 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. You're burning up the carbon for fuel, but you're tying up the nitrogen. This is the finished product. Look how much it looks like good soil, how crumbly, how there's virtually nothing. There's a few lumps in here. That would have been rocks or something. But there's virtually nothing left in it that wasn't digested and converted back into humic forms. And this spreads really nicely, and all the whole works. And this is an analysis of fairly good compost. And the really important part to see is here in the nitrogen, look, there's 10,920 parts per million in the total test. It's got a really good carbon to nitrogen ratio because actually it's 6.29 to 1. Geez, it's really got a high nitrogen. It's tied up. But when you look at it there, and the nitrogen to sulfur ratio is nearly ideal too, actually. And I don't have the bars working right on this graph, but it's 5.82 to 1. Could have stood a little more sulfur, but it's really close. But what you're looking at here in the soluble nitrogen is there's 659.8 or something like that, 652 parts per million nitrate, and only 18.6 parts per million ammonium. And so most of the nitrogen in that compost is tied up in the total test. And that's a compost I'd be happy to use at 500 pounds per acre on my wheat crop. And you'd see the difference. And you grow a wheat that is bricks of 18 maybe, or 20, or depending on various factors, but it's going to surely be over 10, whereas your neighbor using anhydrous is probably going to be around 4 to 6. You don't have to have a refractometer. You can go out there and pinch some off and chew it, and you will see. And if the silica is high in it, it's hard to chew. That's your cell walls and connective tissues. So if it's hard to chew, you got good silica. And if it takes a long time and it's chewing and it's still sweet, it's high bricks. If you chew it and the sweetness disappears pretty quick, it's not high bricks. So look, our senses are our best measure of most of these things, and we sort of like, for some reason or nothing, we disregard our senses. You know, the smell and taste of things is probably the best measure of quality. When I had my local ag scientists at the experiment station tell me, we don't even have a way of measuring quality, I thought, that's awful funny. Every chef from coast to coast knows how to tell quality. How does he do it? Taste and smell. So now I am concerned in this compost that I didn't tie up very much of my sulfur. I really didn't get that much tied up. Sulfur here was 860 something, and over here it's 1878. So this compost has a ways to go yet before it's my ideal compost. But when you're compost testing, if you don't do a total test, you don't know what's actually there. And there's all kinds of people out there, I won't call them by a bad name, but there's all kinds of people out there that say, oh, my compost is better than yours because I have more NPK in my compost. And they're doing a soluble analysis of both composts, and they think it's great to have that high solubility, which will grow weeds. And it'll wash away. And it isn't just a stimulant for the biological activities in the soil that actually are what delivers the nutrients to the plant. No. It shuts down the biological activity of the soil, and then you're just as good as any other chemical farmer. So I really want to emphasize this about composting. And you can see here in this fairly good compost how much nutrients are tied up. It's quite a lot. I've got potassium, 8,595 parts per million. Of calcium, I've got 28,555. And you can see that there's a little bit different range of targets for some of these elements in compost. You're going to have less calcium and more potassium because of the nature of things, breaking down woody stalks and woody products in general. So I think that should wind up my presentation, and you can get with me afterwards to buy these discs that you can take home with you, and you can ask questions afterwards. I'm going to be in the, what do you call that, Margaret, where the consultants? Yeah, consulting rooms from 11 until 1. They're going to let me have a bathroom break.
Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Weston Larson of Acres USA. We're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.